The sky above the high ridges of the Colorado mountains was a sheet of dull, unforgiving steel. Snow had been falling since morning, not the kind of gentle flurry that passed in an hour, but a steady, relentless curtain that blurred the tree line and buried the world in a thick, profound silence. The wind wasn't screaming. It was worse. It was a quiet, sharp, and invasive thing, threading through the cracks of the pine woods and down into the isolated basin where the land flattened, just enough for a man to hide from the world. Silas Croft had been splitting logs since noon, his movements a steady, powerful rhythm against the cold. His gloves were stiff, and his shoulders were tight from the chill that crept through even the wool-lined sleeves of his coat. At 38, he was a broad-chested man, worn down not by age, but by a past he never spoke of. Silas lived here because it was far from other people. That was the entire point. The cabin was his fortress, a weather-beaten structure with warped shutters and snow pressed thick against its base. He had lived here since the betrayal that had ended his old life. That was almost 10 years back. There were no visitors. There were no neighbors. There was just the snow, the trees, and his quiet, unchanging routines. So when he heard the sound, a soft, irregular crunch in the snow, faint but undeniably real, his first instinct was not curiosity, but caution. He straightened from his work, axe still in hand, his eyes narrowing on the woods beyond his fence line. At first, he thought it was a deer or an elk, driven low by the storm. Then he thought it might be a prospector, lost and desperate. He didn't move, just listened, his back rigid, his boots half buried in a drift. Then he saw her. A woman, thin and dark against the blinding light, staggering toward his porch. Her legs sank through the deep snow with each step, her arms clutched tight to her chest. Her hair was long and black, braided in a single thick cord down her back. Her skin was the warm brown of the Shoshone, who sometimes hunted these mountains. She was barefoot. Silas's gut tensed immediately. Not from hatred, he wasn't that kind of man, but from what he knew of survival. Shoshone women didn't wander alone in the high country in the middle of a blizzard, barefoot and near collapse, unless something had gone terribly, violently wrong. He stepped toward her slowly, his mind already tracking possibilities. She could be bait. There could be others in the woods, warriors waiting for him to lower his guard. But as she came closer, stumbling now, her legs barely lifting through the heavy snow, that thought began to fade. Her face was wrong for a trap. It was raw, exhausted, and filled with a terror that was utterly genuine. She dropped to her knees. In the snow, not 10 yards from his steps, her hands splaying into the drift, her body swaying as if she would pass out right there. He watched for another second, every instinct for self-preservation yelling at him to maintain his distance, warning him against stepping into a story that was not his. He didn't know her. He didn't owe her a thing. He lived a quiet life, and that quiet had kept him alive. Then she looked up, her dark eyes finding his. "Please," she said, her voice a dry, tight whisper, barely audible over the wind. Her lips were cracked and blue. "Let me in." Silas's jaw tightened. He didn't move. "I can reward you," she added, her voice lower this time, her teeth chattering. "Please." She had nothing. No pack, no boots, no visible weapon. No frostbite yet, but it was coming. Her fingers were stiff and red. Her toes, sunk deep in snow that must have burned like fire, would be next. Silas thought about walking back inside and bolting the door. He thought about staying quiet, letting the storm finish what it had already started. She'd be gone by morning, and no one would ever know. No risk, no complication, just the same quiet he always kept. But he didn't move away. Instead, he stepped forward. He crouched beside her, his movements slow, testing her reactions. She didn't flinch. She was past fear now. Her face twisted slightly, not in panic, but in a kind of profound shame. She wasn't pleading anymore. She looked like she was waiting for a final judgment. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice even but low. She shook her head, a barely perceptible movement. Silas looked around once, into the trees, toward the ridge, into the nothingness of the cold white wilderness that had been his only companion for a decade. And then he decided. He hooked one arm under her knees, the other behind her back, and lifted her. She was lighter than she should have been. Her body tensed against his chest, but she didn't fight him. She didn't speak again. He carried her to the porch, kicked the door open with his boot. The warmth of the cabin hit them immediately. Inside, the fire in the stone hearth was steady, built strong before noon. A pot of venison stew simmered on the stove, filling the air with the rich scent of meat and herbs. The room was sparse-a-cot, a table, a few shelves, but it was clean and dry. It smelled like smoke, dust, and pine. He set her down gently on the thick bearskin rug beside the hearth and went to grab the heaviest blanket from his cot. She leaned against the warm stone of the fireplace, her head tilted back, her breathing shallow but steady. Her eyes blinked open, trying to take in the room. She looked at the table, at the rifle mounted on the wall, then at him again. Suspicion flickered in her eyes, but it was weak, dulled by exhaustion and the creeping cold. Silas knelt beside her and began wrapping the blanket around her legs. "Keep your feet off the floor," he said, his tone flat and practical. "You'll lose them if they stay that cold." Still, she said nothing. He checked her hands. Her fingertips were chapped and red, the skin tight, but they were not yet black with frostbite. He had gotten to her in time. He poured hot water from the kettle into a tin mug, added a pinch of salt and a spoonful of the honey he'd saved from last spring, and handed it to her. "Drink it, slow. If you throw it up, I'm not cleaning it." She took the cup with both hands. They shook as she tried to lift it to her lips, but she managed. Silas sat back on his heels and watched her drink, his expression unreadable. Her throat moved with each swallow, slow and careful. Her eyes stayed on him over the rim of the cup, watching, waiting. But she didn't speak again. He didn't ask her name, and he didn't offer his. It was enough that she was here, that he hadn't left her out there to freeze. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know who she was or what she wanted. But he did know this. No one deserved to die like that, alone in the snow. He'd seen enough of that during the war. Too many. He didn't want company. He didn't want conversation. But he also couldn't walk away from someone who couldn't stand on their own. Not anymore. The snow kept falling through the night, coating the shutters in a thick layer of silence and burying the fences until only the tops of the posts showed through the drifts. The wind pushed against the cabin walls, but the old logs held firm. Inside, the fire stayed lit, fed steadily by Silas's hand every hour. The woman Tala, as she had called herself, hadn't said another word since he'd brought her in. She hadn't cried. She didn't ask questions or demand anything. She sat there, silent, leaning against the hearth, her eyes dull but watchful. At some point, she fell asleep, her knees tucked up to her chest, the wool blanket wrapped tightly around her body. Silas hadn't moved her. He just laid another folded quilt beside her in case she woke cold. He watched her for a moment before sitting at his table with a plate of stew and bread. He ate without hurry, listening to the wood crackle and pop, watching the snow drift sideways across the dark window. His mind kept circling back to her. What tribe was she from? Why was she alone? How far had she walked barefoot through that snow? The cold could kill fast out here. He knew that better than most. A man couldn't last more than an hour barefoot in weather like this. And yet, she had made it to his door, barely, but still breathing Dot around midnight. She stirred. Silas glanced over. Her eyes were open, but she didn't look at him. She looked at the fire, then at her own feet, which he had bandaged and propped up on a low stool. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Her fingers clutched the edge of the blanket a little tighter. "You're lucky they're still pink," Silas said, his voice quiet but not unkindly. "Another hour, and they'd have been gone." Her eyes shifted to him slowly. This time she spoke, her voice low and raspy. "I walked for 2 days." Silas frowned. "No boots?" She shook her head. "Taken, when they cast me out." He didn't say anything for a moment. He didn't want to press, but he needed to understand the danger he had invited into his home. "Who cast you out?" "My people." The words hung in the room for a long time. He could have asked why, but the weight of her admission made it clear. She wasn't speaking for sympathy, just stating the truth. Silas nodded once. "You hungry?" She hesitated, then gave the smallest of nods. He stood, ladled some stew into a bowl, tore off a thick chunk of bread, and set it in front of her with a spoon. She took the bowl slowly, her hands still shaking. She ate steadily, every motion deliberate, as if she'd been taught not to waste a single bite. She finished half the bowl before setting it aside and pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "What's your name?" He asked. "Neva." He... Let that sit a moment. "I'm Silas." She gave a small nod, then turned her face slightly back to the fire. He watched her for a while, waiting to see if she'd speak more. She didn't. He noticed then what he hadn't fully caught before. Her dress, what was left of it, was ceremonial Shoshone in style, but the beading, the stitching, even the cut of the hide was formal. It wasn't travel wear. It wasn't hunting wear. It was something worn at gatherings, rituals, or events of status. It was torn, scuffed with pine sap, and thin enough to bleed the heat out of her within minutes. By morning, the storm had buried the entire yard under another foot of snow. The fence line had disappeared completely, and even the small chicken coop was nearly sealed shut by a wind-carved drift. The sky stayed low and pale, heavy with the promise of more of the same. Cold like this didn't let up easily, not this high in the mountains. It pressed in, day after day, until the logs cracked in the cabin walls, and the water buckets froze solid if left unattended. Silas was already outside by dawn, clearing a path to the barn with a heavy shovel. His breath came out in thick clouds, and his fingers, even gloved, stung as he worked. He checked on his 2 milk cows, their breath huffing in the cold air, and shoveled fresh straw into their stalls. He didn't rush. That was part of staying alive out here. You did the work, steady, no matter how bad the wind bit. If he left the snow on the barn roof, it could collapse. If he waited too long to clear a path, the livestock would suffer. And he wasn't about to let that happen. He hadn't fought through 10 winters up here, just to lose it all to a spell of bad weather. Inside, Neva woke to the smell of ash and beans warming on the stove. Her legs still burned with a dull ache, and her toes, though painful, had some feeling again. She wiggled them beneath the blanket, her brow furrowed from both the discomfort and the effort of gauging the damage. Her hands were less raw now, but her mind wasn't any quieter. She looked around the cabin again, slower this time, taking in the details, the rifle on the wall, the way everything was positioned for efficiency, not comfort. No wasted space, nothing decorative. A man's place. A man who didn't expect guests. She sat up, wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, and slowly tested her feet on the ground. Pain shot up her calves, but she could bear it. She limped to the stove, holding on to the edge of the table for balance. That's where Silas found her when he stepped back in, her back to him, one hand braced on the stove as she tried to ladle food from the pot. "You should have waited," he said flatly, stepping inside and kicking the snow from his boots before closing the door behind him. She didn't turn. "I'm not helpless." He didn't argue with that. He took off his gloves, unwrapped his scarf, and moved toward the wash basin. "That doesn't mean you're not injured." She finally looked over her shoulder, her face guarded but calm. "I can do small things." Silas gave a brief nod. "All right. Just don't fall over." He dried his hands and came over to adjust the flame under the pot. She moved aside, allowing him to finish ladling 2 bowls. He handed her one without ceremony. They ate at the table again, this time together, still quiet, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It wasn't tight with uncertainty. It was practical, midway. Through the meal, Silas asked the question that had been on his mind all morning. "Where were you trying to go?" Neva chewed slowly before answering. "I wasn't." He frowned slightly. "So what then?" "I just walked." He didn't understand. Into the snow? With no food or boots? She looked at him steadily, her dark eyes holding his. "I wasn't supposed to live." The room went still. Silas's hand tightened around his tin cup. He didn't ask the next question. He didn't need to. She'd answered enough. She had been cast out to die. He stared at the table, the food suddenly tasteless. He'd seen war. He'd seen casual cruelty. But this turning your back on one of your own, leaving them in the heart of winter to starve or freeze, it worked against everything he believed a person should be. "You don't strike me as someone who gives up," he said finally. Neva's face twitched, a barely perceptible flicker of emotion, but her voice stayed even. "I did not want to die, but I accepted it." Silas didn't know what to say to that. There wasn't a right answer. He stood up, cleared the bowls, and set them in the wash basin. "You can stay here," he said again, his voice firmer this time. "Long as you need, I got room." Neva looked at him, really looked at him, not as a potential threat or a temporary savior, but as a man. He didn't flinch. He didn't offer her anything he couldn't keep. Later that day, she asked for a knife. Silas hesitated. "What for?" "My hair," she said, pointing to the frayed, frozen ends of her braid. "It's tangled and dirty. I do not want to carry the past on my back." He nodded once and handed her his small utility blade. She took it without ceremony and went to sit by the fire. He didn't watch her do it, but later he saw the long dark braid laid out on the floor beside the coals. She had trimmed her hair short, clean, and even, just below her shoulders. Her eyes were calmer afterward, as if she had shed a great weight. The snow had started to settle into hard, windswept crusts by the 4th morning. The temperatures had stayed low enough that nothing melted, but the blizzard winds had finally eased. Still no clear skies, but there was less urgency in the cold. Now? John noticed it first when his axe didn't stick with every swing, when the barn door didn't freeze shut by mid-morning, and when the cows were moving easier, huffing clouds of breath but not huddling close to the walls anymore. Inside the cabin, things had shifted too, slowly and subtly. Neva no longer needed help to stand. She still limped, her feet still tender from the cold, but she moved around the cabin on her own now, fetching kindling from the wood box, helping to peel potatoes for the stew, straightening the bedding without being asked. She didn't speak much, but Silas had stopped waiting for her too. When she did speak, her voice was calmer, more grounded. He had added another log to the fire when he heard an awkward scraping of metal and a muttered breath. He turned and saw her struggling to carry the heavy water bucket from the stove to the wash basin. It was too heavy for her, and her grip was still weak from her cold, damaged fingers. "You don't have to do that," he said, crossing the room in 2 long strides. "I want to," she replied, keeping her eyes on the bucket as it tipped slightly. "Let me do something." He took it from her anyway, not as a dismissal, but with steady hands, pouring the hot water without spilling a drop. She didn't fight him. She just took a step back and stood quietly until it was done. Then she said it out of nowhere, her voice low but firm. It was a lie. Silas turned toward her, confused. "The hunt," she clarified. "The one they blamed me for." "It was not my fault." He didn't interrupt. "The chief's son, Kono, he led the hunt. He is proud and foolish." He ignored the signs of the storm, pushed the hunters too far into the high country. When the blizzard hit, they lost the trail, lost 2 men to the cold. He needed someone to blame, someone who could not fight back. "And he chose you, Silas." Finished for her. Neva nodded once. "My father spoke against him in council once. Kono has never forgotten it. He said my presence was bad medicine, that a woman on the hunt brought bad luck. And the elders, they believed him. It was easier then." Admitting the chief's son had failed. Silas didn't judge her. He'd seen worse done by better men for lesser reasons. He just nodded slowly, understanding the cold calculus of power and blame. That explained everything: the ceremonial dress she was wearing when he found her, the reason she was cast out so suddenly, with no time to prepare. It was an execution disguised as tribal justice. That afternoon, Silas worked on repairing the chicken coop outside, while Neva stayed inside and washed her hair with melted snow water. He didn't see it, but when he came in later, she had braided it clean, tied with a short length of twine. Her posture seemed straighter. The torn ceremonial dress she'd arrived in was now layered with one of his own flannel shirts, the sleeves rolled, the hem tucked under a belt she had fashioned from a strip of leather. She still walked like someone guarding her steps, but there was purpose in it now. That evening, while the stew simmered, Silas asked a question that had been lingering since day 1. "Did you plan to go back when the thaw comes?" Neva didn't answer immediately. She stirred the pot, her eyes fixed on the steam. Then she said, "There is nowhere to go back to. My tribe is not my tribe anymore." He waited, but she didn't elaborate. He didn't push her. "You've lived here long?" she asked after a while, changing the subject. 10 years, since the war." "Your wife," she said, her voice soft. "Did she like it here?" "She never saw it. I was building this place when she left me." The admission came out before he could stop it, a truth he hadn't spoken aloud in a decade. Neva's face didn't change, but she sat down quietly across from him. "I'm sorry." He gave a small nod. "You're not the only one who's lost something." They ate together again, this time with less silence between them. She asked about the cows, about the garden he tried to grow in the summer. He showed her the root cellar and where the smoked meat was stored. They talked about work, not about feelings. That was the way they both understood things best. Before bed, she stood near the window, watching the snowfall lighten into a fine, glittering drift. Silas said, "Spring is still a long ways off, but if you stay through it, I'll help you build your own place. A small cabin, maybe, down by the creek." She turned toward him slowly, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "You're offering me a place?" "I'm offering you the choice," he said. She didn't answer then, but when she laid down on her cot that night, she didn't wrap herself in the blanket as tightly. And for the first time since she arrived, she slept without fear in her eyes. The days began to stretch slightly longer, though the sun still barely made it over the high eastern ridge before dipping behind the trees again. A weak thaw touched the edges of the snowpack near the cabin, but only during the warmest hours of the day. Icicles clung to the roof, and the wind still carried the bite of deep winter. But something had shifted inside the cabin. Something steady, quiet, and new. Neva had started waking before Silas. She didn't make noise or take up space. She just moved about the cabin with quiet, efficient hands, rekindling the fire in the stove, checking the water buckets, wiping down the small wooden table. Her limp was still there, a slight hesitation in her step, but it was lighter now. And with each morning she stayed, the air between them settled a little more. Silas noticed the details without trying. How she folded the blankets on her cot into a neat, tight square. How she handled the knife while slicing potatoes, her movements sure and practiced. How she touched everything in the cabin as if it belonged to her, but never once assumed it did. He had never known a woman like that, not with that kind of quiet, self-contained presence. One morning, as they ate their breakfast of oatmeal side by side, Neva looked up and asked, "Do you still go into town?" He wiped the edge of his mouth with his sleeve and nodded. "Once every few weeks. Sometimes longer, depending on the weather." "Is it far?" 15 miles, if the trail's clear. 20 if I have to go around the ridge." "The people there," she said, her voice careful. "Do they know you?" "They know I keep to myself," he replied. She didn't ask to go. She didn't ask about the people. But her questions told him she was thinking ahead. Past mere survival. Later that day, Silas brought down a pile of old, seasoned lumber from the loft above the barn. He started laying it out beside the cabin. The boards were rough, some warped from age, but still usable. Neva stood on the porch, her arms crossed against the cold, watching him. "You meant it," she said after a while, her voice a quiet statement. "About building something." "I don't say things I don't mean," he said. She stepped down from the porch onto the snow-packed ground and moved beside him. "Then let me help." "You sure?" She nodded. He handed her a hammer and began, showing her how the framing would be done. Simple, strong, nothing fancy. Just enough space for a small room on the side of the cabin. A place where she could have her own space, her own privacy. It wasn't a gesture of control. It was one of permanence. As they worked, she asked questions about the wood, the nails, how to keep the boards flush. She learned fast, her hands still rough and unsteady from the cold, but her spirit was determined. He saw her grit her teeth when her foot ached, but she never sat down, not once. But as the days wore on, Silas noticed a change in her, a persistent. Dry cough started to rack her body. At first, it was just in the mornings, but soon it lingered all day. Her skin took on a pale, almost translucent quality, and dark circles appeared beneath her eyes. He made her a strong tea from pine needles and honey, an old woodsman's remedy, but it did little good. One evening, as they were sitting by the fire, a violent coughing fit seized her. It left her breathless and trembling, a fine sheen of sweat on her forehead despite the chill in the room. "It's my lungs," she whispered, her voice a ragged breath. The cold from that first night. He knew she was right. The prolonged exposure, the walk barefoot through the snow, had taken a toll. He felt a surge of cold fear, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to experience in a decade. He had fought so hard to keep the world and its pain at a distance, and now it was inside his home, threatening the one person who had managed to breach his walls. He tried every remedy he knew, hot compresses, strong broths, endless cups of tea. But the fever took hold, and she grew weaker, slipping in and out of a delirious sleep. In one of her lucid moments, her eyes fluttered open and found his. Her hand, hot and dry, reached for his. "There is a root," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "high on the mountain, near the frozen waterfall. It grows beneath the red stones. It has a bitter taste, but it breaks the fever." He knew the place she meant. It was a treacherous 2-day journey in good weather. In the dead of winter, with the trails buried under feet of snow, it was suicide. "Rest," he said, his voice gentle. "I'll take care of you." But as he sat by her cot through the long night, listening to her ragged, shallow breaths, he knew his simple care wasn't enough. The fever was winning. He looked at her, at the strong, proud woman reduced to a fragile whisper, and he knew. He was facing a choice. He could stay here, safe in his warm cabin, and watch her die, just as he had watched his wife and child die. Or he could walk out into the frozen wilderness, into the heart of the storm, and fight for her. The decision, when it came, was not a decision at all. It was a certainty. Silas could not sit by another fire and watch someone he cared for be consumed by a fever. He would not be helpless again. He spent the hour before dawn preparing. He packed a small satchel with dried venison, a flint and steel, and his sharpest knife. He strapped on the snowshoes he hadn't used in years, their leather bindings stiff and cold. He checked his rifle, loading it not for men this time, but for the wolves, or mountain lions that might be driven to desperation by the long winter. He banked the fire high, leaving a large pot of water warming on the hearth for Neva, and placed a cup and a spoon within her reach, though he doubted she would have the strength to use them. He stood over her for a long moment, watching the faint, troubled rise and fall of her chest beneath the heavy blankets. Her face was flushed with fever, her lips dry and cracked. He reached out and brushed a strand of damp hair from her forehead, his touch surprisingly gentle. "I'll be back," he whispered, though he knew she couldn't hear him. It was a promise to himself as much as to her. He stepped out of the cabin and into a world of blinding white. The storm had passed, but the cold was absolute, a silent, deadly thing that stole the breath from his lungs. The mountains loomed before him, their peaks shrouded in mist, looking like indifferent, sleeping giants. The place Neva had described, the frozen waterfall, was on the far side of the highest ridge, a place he normally wouldn't attempt to reach until late spring. The journey was brutal. The snowshoes kept him from sinking completely, but each step was a laborious effort, his legs sinking deep into the powdery drifts. The wind was a constant razor-sharp presence, cutting through his thick coat and stinging his exposed skin. He moved by instinct, following the familiar contours of the land that were now hidden beneath a uniform blanket of white. He thought of Neva, of her quiet strength, of the way she had looked at him across the fire. He thought of the life that was flickering out in his cabin. That thought was the fire that drove him on, a small, stubborn ember of warmth against the overwhelming cold. He was no longer just a man surviving. He was a man on a mission, with a purpose that went beyond his own solitary existence. He reached the base of the high ridge by midday, his body aching, his lungs burning. The climb was the most dangerous part. The snow hid the treacherous, icy rocks beneath, and a single misstep could send him tumbling hundreds of feet to his death. He used his axe to cut handholds in the ice, pulling himself up, foot by agonizing foot dot. As he neared the top, he heard a low growl. A mountain lion, gaunt and desperate from hunger, stood on a ledge above him, its yellow eyes fixed on him. In another time, Silas would have raised his rifle without a second thought. But today, he felt a strange kinship with the starving beast. They were both just trying to survive in a world that offered little mercy. He stood still, meeting the animal's gaze, and after a long, tense moment, the cat seemed to make a decision. With a flick of its tail, it turned and disappeared over the ridge. He finally reached the summit as the sun began to dip low, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of orange and pink. Below him, he could see it, a massive waterfall, frozen. Mid-tumble, a spectacular curtain of blue and white ice, and at its base, a cluster of distinctive red stones, just as Neva had described. He scrambled down the other side of the ridge, his exhaustion forgotten. He found the stones and began to dig frantically with his hands and his knife, the frozen earth resisting his efforts. Finally, his knife struck something hard. He cleared away the snow and dirt and pulled it free. It was a gnarled, dark brown root about the length of his hand. It smelled bitter and earthy. He didn't know if it would work, but it was their only hope. He did not rest. He turned and began the long, treacherous journey back, the precious root tucked safely inside his coat, a fragile talisman against the encroaching darkness. Silas stumbled back into the cabin just as the last of the light faded from the sky, his body a single throbbing ache. He was covered in snow, his beard frosted with ice, and his exhaustion was so profound it felt like a physical weight. But he had the root. Neva was as he had left her, her breathing even more shallow, her skin hot to the touch. He didn't waste a moment. He shaved a small piece of the root into a cup, added hot water from the kettle, and let it steep into a dark, bitter-smelling tea. He lifted her head gently, cradling it in his arm. "Neva," he whispered, "you need to drink this." Her eyes fluttered open, but they were unfocused, lost in the haze of the fever. He brought the cup to her lips and tilted it, letting the dark liquid trickle into her mouth. She coughed weakly, but managed to swallow. He gave her a little more, then sat back, his work done. Now all he could do was wait. He sat by her cot, for hours watching, listening to every ragged breath. He bathed her forehead with cool cloths, and when she shivered, he added another blanket, tucking it tightly around her. He did not sleep. He simply kept his vigil, a silent guardian against the darkness that was trying to claim her. Sometime before dawn, something changed. Her breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, began to deepen, to even out. A fierce heat radiating from her skin began to subside. He placed a hand on her forehead. It was still warm, but no longer burning. The root was working. A wave of relief so powerful it made him dizzy washed over him. He leaned his head against the rough-hewn wall of the cabin and closed his eyes, a silent prayer of thanks on his lips. When Neva finally woke, the morning sun was streaming through the single clean window, filling the small cabin with a pale, hopeful light. Her eyes were clear, the fog of fever gone. She looked around the room, then at Silas, who was slumped in the chair beside her, asleep, his head resting on his chest. She saw the exhaustion etched on his face, the ice still clinging to his beard, the dirt under his fingernails. She saw the empty cup on the table beside her, and she understood. He had gone for the root. He had risked his own life in the storm to save hers. She reached out a weak hand and touched his arm. He started awake, his eyes instantly alert. They looked at each other in the quiet morning light, the silence between them filled with a new, profound understanding. "You came back," she whispered, her voice still weak but clear. "I told you I would," he replied, his voice rough with emotion in the days that followed. As Neva slowly regained her strength, the last of the walls between them dissolved. The silence was no longer one of caution or necessity, but of a deep, comfortable companionship. He would tell her stories of his time as a trapper, and she would tell him stories of her people, of the legends of the mountains. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he finally took the small, worn coat that had belonged to his wife from the chest where he had kept it for 10 years. It was wool-lined, patched at the shoulders, but still solid and warm. He placed it beside her without a word. Neva looked at the coat, then at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. She didn't refuse it. She picked it up gently, her hands smoothing. Over the soft, worn cloth, she tried it on. It was a little large on her, but it was warm. She nodded once. "Thank you, Silas." It was the first time she had said his name with such warmth, such intimacy. That night, she did not return to her cot. She came to his, climbing beneath the heavy quilt without hesitation, her body fitting against his as if it had always belonged. There, he held her close, not with passion, but with a deep, reverent tenderness. Their bodies moved together quietly, without ceremony or urgency. It was not about heat or hunger. It was slow, steady, a meeting of two souls who had survived the winter and found their spring. The fire cracked behind them, and when it was done, they didn't speak. They didn't need to. The thaw had finally come, both outside the cabin and within their hearts. The thaw came in earnest by mid-April. The stubborn snowpack receded from the lower trails, and the air, though still sharp in the mornings, carried the scent of damp earth and new life. The pines dripped with meltwater, and the creek near the cabin, once a frozen whisper, now ran fast and clear. Birds returned in cautious pairs, their songs a tentative but welcome intrusion on the long silence of winter dot inside the cabin. Life had changed in ways Silas hadn't imagined possible a season ago. The space no longer felt like a shelter built. For one man's grief, it felt lived in. Neva's workbasket sat under the table, filled with mending she never rushed. His shirts hung on the line beside her own flannel wrap. The new room he'd been building before she fell ill was now finished. The door, hung on new hinges, no longer creaked. The floor still smelled of fresh sawdust. It was plain one cot. A chest, a small table near the window, but it belonged to her, not just as a space, but as a sign. A sign that she had a place here. Tala moved slower these days. Her belly had begun to change. Barely at first, not yet a full, round swell, but enough for her to feel the pull in her core when she bent, a new heaviness in her center. She said little about it, but Silas noticed. He saw the way she paused more often when walking, the way her hand drifted toward her lower stomach without thinking. He didn't point it out. He simply adjusted. He took on more of the heavy lifting, stacked extra firewood closer to the door, and made sure her chair by the hearth was always the warmest. One morning, he brought her a basin of warm water and a cloth without being asked. She sat by the stove, soaking her sore feet, her face calm but thoughtful. "You never asked for any of this," she said quietly. "I didn't have to," Silas replied. "You came." She looked up at him. "Are you ready?" "I'm not afraid," he said. And he realized it was the truth. That's enough. She reached for his hand and guided it over the gentle curve of her belly. The child stirred beneath his palm. Stronger now, not just flutters, but a slow, turning pressure. He didn't speak. He only nodded, and she knew. That same afternoon, they walked together to the edge of the ridge where the land dipped down toward the basin. From there, they could see far into the valley. Silas pointed out the new green shoots near the creek, and Neva picked a small sprig of wild mint. She pressed it between her fingers, inhaling its sharp, clean scent, and smiled faintly. It was the first time he had seen her smile without effort, open and without holding anything back. On the way back, Neva stopped at the base of a large ponderosa pine. "My mother," she said, her voice soft. "She is a healer. She would know what to do." It was the first time she had spoken of her family with anything other than the pain of exile. "When the thaw is complete," Silas said, "we'll go down the mountain. We'll leave word at the trading post. Quietly, someone will get a message to her." Neva's eyes filled, not with tears of sorrow, but with something else. Relief. "I just want her to know I lived," she said. "That I did not die in the snow." Silas stepped close and touched her cheek. "We'll make sure she knows." That evening, as Neva prepared a stew with the last of the carrots they'd stored through winter, she paused as the child kicked hard, her hand steadying herself against the table. Silas rose from his chair, moved behind her, and placed his hands on her waist, supporting her. "I've got you," he said. "You always do," she murmured, and leaned back into him. When the fire was low and the dishes washed, she took his hand, led him to their bed, and lay beside him, drawing the heavy quilt up over them both. In the quiet that followed, she turned toward him. "You never asked me to marry you," she said, her voice soft. "I figured I didn't need to," he replied. "We already chose each other." She smiled again, a small, intimate smile just for him. "Still, ask me." Silas looked into her, eyes steady and without hesitation. "Neva," he said, "will you be my wife?" She nodded once. "I already am." The child shifted again, and Silas placed his hand over her belly. This time he said the words aloud, "Our child." She covered his hand with hers and whispered, "Our family." Spring settled in for good the following week. The buds on the aspen trees turned to small green leaves. The hens clucked in the yard, fat and loud again, and the cabin, once just a place of exile and quiet survival, was now a home, rooted, alive. Neva had stayed. Silas had stayed. The child would be born in a few short moons in the room they had built together, in a house where no one would be cast out. In this place, there were no titles, no demands, only presence, choice, and care. And for the first time in both their lives, that was enough.